It started with nothing. Just a quiet afternoon with rain tapping gently against the windows like it always did in late July. The kind of rain that doesn't storm and just lingers, soft, whispering. I was in the kitchen, barefoot on the cool tiles, stirring a pot of tea for one. The house smelled like cardamom and something faintly floral, maybe the perfume I had sprayed on my wrist out of sheer habit. Not for anyone in particular, Dot, my sister, had left that morning for an overnight retreat with her friends, something she'd planned for weeks. She needed the break, and I'd offered to keep an eye on her home while she was away. She trusted me implicitly, and honestly, I loved the house. It always felt warmer than mine, cozier, like it held pieces of her that I missed when we didn't talk for days. What I hadn't expected was to be alone in the house with her husband, Raymai. He was supposed to leave for a client trip. She even mentioned it casually in passing. Oh, he'll be out early tomorrow, don't worry. You'll have the place to yourself. But something had changed. A meeting got canceled or a flight rescheduled. Either way, when I stepped into the living room after pouring myself tea, there he was half asleep on the couch, wearing sweats and a faded t-shirt, a mug of black coffee perched on the table beside him. I hesitated. I don't know why exactly. It's not like I hadn't seen him before. I'd known Ramai for years. He was the calm to my sister's fire, steady and soft-spoken in a way that always made you feel like he was listening, really listening. But today felt different. Hey, he said, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, giving me a crooked half-smile. Didn't expect you so early. I returned the smile awkwardly and glanced toward the kitchen again, as if I might suddenly remember. I left the stove on. Tea? I asked, trying to sound casual. Dot, he stretched, his arms flexing under the thin fabric of his shirt. Sure, if you don't mind. So I poured him a cup and brought it over, placing it on a coaster like it somehow mattered. Like that tiny gesture would keep everything inside its lines. He took it with a soft thanks, and then the silence settled between us, not awkward, but definitely there. We made small talk, the kind that dances on the surface of things. How work had been, whether the rain might ruin the garden, what my sister had packed in her suitcase, like she wasn't only gone for one night. But beneath all that, something subtle stirred. A weight in the air I didn't quite know how to name. Watched him out of the corner of my eye. He looked tired. Not just from lack of sleep, but from something deeper. His eyes lingered on things longer than usual. The raindrops crawling down the glass. The way the steam from his cup curled upward and vanished. Once or twice, I caught him glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Dot, it shouldn't have mattered. But it did. Dot, after lunch, he offered to help me move a few boxes from the guest room ones my sister had asked me to sort through. Old clothes, some books, a few picture frames she didn't know what to do with. We worked side by side for a while in silence, the kind that becomes strangely comfortable when you stop fighting it. I handed him a framed photo of the three of us from a summer barbecue back when things felt lighter. My sister had her arms around both of us, her smile wild and unfiltered. Raymai stared at it longer than I expected. She used to laugh more, he said softly, almost to himself. I didn't respond right away. Because what was I supposed to say to that? That I'd noticed it too? That maybe something inside her had shifted over the years, and none of us wanted to admit it? That sometimes I missed her old laugh, like a song I couldn't hum anymore? She still does, I finally said, though even I wasn't sure if it was true. He looked at me, and for a split second, it felt like we were standing on the edge of something neither of us asked for, something unspoken. Dot, the moment passed. He looked away, placed the frame gently in a box, and stood up. Thanks for helping, I said, mostly just to break the silence. He gave me a small nod. I should probably go for a run, clear my head. I nodded, stepping aside to let him pass. As he did, he brushed against my shoulder lightly, just enough to notice Dot when he left the room. I stood there staring at the empty hallway. My hands felt colder than they should have been. I wasn't sure if it was the weather or something else. Dot later that evening, the rain turned heavier, drumming steadily on the rooftop. I curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book, trying to lose myself in fiction. The house creaked in places I wasn't used to. My mind kept wandering. He was still here, upstairs, probably showering or texting someone back. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself it was none of my business. But even then, part of me noticed that I kept listening for footsteps, that the book I was pretending to read hadn't moved from the same page in half an hour. I don't know when I started overthinking everything. Maybe it was the way he looked at that photo, or how he'd quietly observed me during lunch like he was memorizing something. Or maybe it was just the simple, quiet truth. I was alone in a house with a man I shouldn't be thinking about, and the hours were stretching too long. I thought I heard a floorboard creak upstairs. My breath caught, just for a second. I pulled the blanket tighter and stared at the fireplace that wasn't even lit, trying not to feel too much, trying not to guess what the rest of the night might hold. It had been 3 days since my sister left for her business trip, and Romai had been nothing but considerate. Too considerate, maybe. Every gesture of his, whether handing me a cup of coffee or offering to fix the broken drawer in the hallway, felt dipped in something gentler than politeness. Something that made my stomach tighten, even as I told myself it was nothing. We'd always been distant in a cordial sort of way. He was my sister's husband, the man she'd brought home with that proud smile. And for years I'd tried to be just the right amount of friendly, never too warm, never too cool. But now, with just the two of us in the house, something shifted. I started noticing the small things, like how he'd pause at the top of the stairs before going to bed, as if listening for my movements, or how he'd say my name softly when he spoke to me, not like he was calling someone, but as if he were remembering it out loud. The first real conversation we had happened on the second evening. I was sitting in the living room, curled up with an old blanket, watching some meaningless show just for background noise. He came in quietly, holding a cup of tea in each hand. "I made one for you too," he said, placing the second cup on the table without looking at me directly. "Chamomile, isn't that what you like?" It caught me off guard. I hadn't remembered ever telling him that. I looked up, giving him a small smile. "Thank you, that's sweet." He sat across from me, not too close, but not far either. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Just the soft murmur of the television filled the space between us. "I never realized how quiet this house gets," he said after a while, his voice low. "When Myra's here, there's always something her. Voice, music, calls, the blender running at random hours." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, she has a way of filling space." We both smiled, but his faded sooner than mine. He looked thoughtful, maybe even a little lost. And in that moment, I wasn't looking at my sister's husband. I was looking at a man who felt out of place, out of rhythm, like I did. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, suddenly. "If this feels weird, I can stay somewhere else. I didn't want you to feel like I was intruding." I shook my head almost too quickly. "No, it's okay, really. I feel safer with someone else in the house." He nodded slowly, and for a second, I caught something else in his eyes. Not longing, not desire, just understanding. A quiet, human softness that lingered too long. The next day passed in a rhythm of avoidance. I stayed in my room longer. He spent most of the afternoon in the backyard, tinkering with the broken garden hose. But by the evening, the distance began to bend again. I was folding laundry in the upstairs hallway, my back turned to the stairwell, when I heard his footsteps. I didn't turn around right away. Something inside me stalled as if I needed to control how long I could pretend not to notice him. I felt his presence behind me, polite, quiet, but unmistakably there. You always fold towels like that? He asked softly, standing just a little too close. I smiled at the towel in my hand. Old habit. Mara used to yell at me for not matching corners properly when we were kids. She still does that, he chuckled. The matching corners obsession. I turned halfway to look at him. He was leaning against the wall now, arms crossed, looking down at the pile of clothes as if it were a subject worth studying. I think she gets it from Mom. I added, and our eyes met just for a second too long. He looked away first, adjusting his stance, as if shaking off the weight of whatever had passed between us. She misses you, you know. She talks about you a lot. I paused. That surprised me more than it should have. She doesn't say that to me. I murmured. She doesn't say a lot of things. He said quietly. The moment hung there, suspended like a breath no one wanted to exhale. I could feel something pulling between us, not a force, but an understanding. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that simply grows. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint movements downstairs, and whether they were real or not, they felt like echoes of that unfinished moment. The laundry, the look, the silence. I got up around midnight and wandered into the kitchen. The lights were dim, just the under-cabinet ones Myra insisted on installing years ago. I poured myself water and leaned against the counter, staring into nothing. And then I heard him behind me again, dot Rami dot. He didn't speak at first. He stood in the doorway, shirt wrinkled, hair slightly messy like he hadn't expected to be seen. Can't sleep either? He asked softly. I shook my head. No, just restless. He walked in, slow and careful, like every step was a choice. You ever wonder, he said after a pause, why some silences feel heavier than others? I turned to look at him, trying to understand the question under the question. Yeah, I said. All the time. He leaned against the opposite counter, facing me, arms folded again. I used to think silence was peace. Lately, it just feels like noise you can't hear. We stayed like that for a while, just breathing the same air, thinking thoughts neither of us was brave enough to say out loud. And yet, something had already been said. Something wordless. Something dangerous that night as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I wasn't thinking about my sister, or guilt, or consequences. I was thinking about how Rama looked at me like I was someone he hadn't fully seen before, and how, for a moment, I let him, and I couldn't stop wondering what might happen if I let him again. By the time the fourth evening arrived, I had stopped pretending that everything felt normal, Dot. There was a certain weight in the air between us now, a stillness that clung to every interaction, stretching the space between eye contact, between words, between footsteps down the hallway. And it wasn't a bad kind of stillness. It was the kind that made your breath shallow without realizing it. The kind that made every small detail, the sound of a teacup on the counter, the soft creak of a stair feel louder, more significant. Rama and I had exchanged fewer words that day. Not out of awkwardness, but out of something quieter, deeper. Like the presence of something new neither of us knew how to name. That evening, rain started falling again. I stood at the living room window, watching the droplets race each other down the glass. My arms were wrapped around myself, not because I was cold, but because I didn't know where else to place them. Behind me, I could hear the faint hum of the dishwasher finishing its cycle. The house, otherwise, was silent, except I could feel him. Somewhere nearby, like gravity. I used to love the rain, Ramai's voice said behind me, soft and closer than I expected. It used to calm me. Now it just echoes. I didn't turn around at first. I wasn't sure what I'd see in his face if I did. or what he might see in mine. It still calms me, I replied. But only in moments like this, when everything else is quiet enough to hear it. I felt him step beside me. Not too close, not inappropriate, but near enough that I could sense his body heat. We stood side by side in front of the glass, both of us watching the rain in a silence that somehow said more than speech ever could. Have you ever felt like... He started, then hesitated. I turned to look at him. He was staring at the window, brows furrowed, jaw clenched just slightly, like your life just slid into a version you never chose. He finished. I inhaled deeply every day. He finally turned to me, and in that moment, our eyes met with a shared honesty I hadn't prepared for. There was no flirtation, no inappropriate smile, just recognition. Two people who had lived quietly behind curtains, behind responsibility, behind the weight of being the good one. I loved Myra, he said, almost as if confessing something shameful. I still do in many ways. But sometimes I wonder if what we had stopped growing a long time ago, and we just never wanted to admit it. I lowered my eyes, unsure if it was my place to hear that. Unsure if part of me wanted to hear it. I'm sorry, he added quickly. I shouldn't be saying this to you. It's just, I don't know. These past few days, you've felt more like someone I've known forever than anyone else in a long time. I swallowed hard. The part of me that knew right from wrong screamed to change the subject, to laugh it off, to leave the room. But the quieter part, the one that had been starved of connection, of being seen, stood still. You haven't done anything wrong, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. He looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing a version of me that no one ever bothered to look for. I know this is complicated, he said, and I'd never want to hurt you or Myra, but I also can't pretend these days haven't meant something. I let that sit between us for a long moment. I didn't answer right away, because if I answered, I'd be choosing a side of myself I had kept buried for years. So instead I whispered, I don't know what this is, but I know I felt more like myself this week than I have in a long time. Raymai nodded slowly, and then very carefully, he reached out and placed his hand on mine, not possessively, not lustfully, just a simple gesture of connection. Our hands stayed there, lightly touching on the windowsill, the rain continuing. To tap the glass like a soft warning, I won't cross any lines, he said, his voice barely audible. But I had to say it, because pretending not to feel it would be a lie. I didn't move my hand away. I didn't know if that made me brave or weak. Later that night, I found myself standing in the hallway outside his guest room. I didn't know why. I told myself I had gone to check on the thermostat, but I hadn't touched it. The door was slightly ajar. I could see the glow of the lamp inside, hear the faint shuffling of pages turning. My heart thudded in a rhythm I couldn't control. I thought about my sister, about loyalty, about guilt, and I also thought about loneliness, about the 1,000 quiet compromises we make in life to keep things looking perfect, about the moments that slip through our fingers because we're too afraid to reach for them. I didn't walk in. I didn't knock Dot, but I stood there longer than I should have. When I finally turned away and returned to my room, my chest ached not with desire, but with the weight of something unsaid, something powerful, something both dangerous and impossibly human. Sleep came late, and when it did, it was filled with soft images. His eyes in the lamplight, the sound of rain, the warmth of a hand that asked for nothing but understanding. Whatever happened next, I knew we'd already crossed the most powerful line of all, the one between indifference and care, between being strangers in the same house and something else neither of us could yet name. The house felt different that morning, quieter somehow, though the same sounds still lingered, the faint clinking of dishes being put away, The low hum of the fridge, the muted shuffle of footsteps. But underneath it all was something else. A silence that had nothing to do with noise. A silence that lived inside me now, pressing against my ribs like a truth I hadn't fully said out loud. Raymai had already been up when I came downstairs. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee he hadn't yet touched. The light coming through the window painted soft gold across his face, making him look more tired than usual. Or maybe just more honest. He looked up when he heard me and offered a small smile, hesitant, as if unsure whether to give me the version of himself from yesterday or the version from a month ago. I didn't smile back. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't know who I was supposed to be either. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," I replied. Keeping my voice steady, I poured myself some coffee and sat down across from him. The space between us felt narrower than the table suggested. I watched the steam rise from my cup, trying to find something to say that wouldn't unravel everything we'd been carefully avoiding. "She's coming back tomorrow," he said. After a while, no explanation needed. We both knew who he meant. I nodded, the motion feeling heavier than it should have. "That's good," I murmured. "Yeah," he said, but it didn't sound convincing. We didn't talk for a long time after that. Just sat there, each of us inside our own storm. What had started as unspoken tension had grown into something deeper, something tender and terrifying. It wasn't physical. It wasn't scandalous, but it was real. And real was sometimes more dangerous than anything else. I found myself walking through the house differently that day, more aware of everything. Of the scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway, of the way the light caught his silhouette in the evening, of how many times my phone lit up with a message from Myra, cheerful updates that suddenly felt like they belonged in a different world. I hated myself a little for the part of me that wanted more time, more silence, more almost. Later that afternoon, Raymai found me in the garden. I had gone outside to clear my head, but instead, I ended up sitting on the back steps, hugging my knees, listening to the wind push softly through the hedges. He sat beside me, not saying anything at first. We watched the leaves sway, the clouds shift. The world continued to spin like it didn't care what two people were or weren't saying to each other. "I don't know how we got here," I finally whispered. "I do," he said gently. "We were lonely and honest." That's a rare combination. I looked over at him. His profile was calm, but his jaw was tight, like he was holding something back. "I've never done this," I said. "Been in this kind of space with someone I shouldn't." His eyes turned to meet mine. "Neither have I." I wanted to believe him. And I think I did, because what was between us wasn't cheap. It wasn't impulsive. It was slow and aching and full of restraint. He leaned forward then, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. "Do you think we'll forget this?" he asked quietly. "When Myra's back, when things are normal again?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was I already knew I wouldn't forget. "Not ever, no," I said. "But maybe we'll pretend." He looked at me then, really looked. And I felt a swell of something in my chest, grief, longing, guilt, and something dangerously close to love. Not love for what we were, but love for what we saw in each other. The parts no one else had asked about Dot as the sun dipped behind the clouds. And the air grew cooler. Raymai said something I'll never forget. "I don't want to lie to her," he whispered. "But I also don't want to erase this." It was the kind of sentence that left a scar. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something inside me to decide. To choose. To settle Dot around midnight, I got up and went downstairs. The house was quiet. No footsteps. No lights. Just the ticking of the clock on the living room wall. I found Remai in the kitchen again, sitting at the same table as if he'd been waiting. Or maybe as if he couldn't sleep either. He stood when he saw me, not quickly, just enough to show that he hadn't stopped thinking about us. Can we talk? I asked. He nodded, and I sat down across from him. I think we need to let this go, I said, each word like a stone in my throat. Before we cross something we can't ever come back from. He nodded again, eyes glassy but steady. I know. And we won't speak of it, I added. Not to Myra, not again. This stays here. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. Then let me just say it once. Not as your sister's husband. Not even as someone who wants more. Just as a man who's seen your heart this week and won't forget it. I felt tears sting the backs of my eyes, but I blinked them away. I couldn't cry. Not now. Not for this. I won't forget either, I whispered. We didn't hug. We didn't touch. We just sat there across from one another, breathing the same moment, knowing it was the last of its kind. The next morning, I helped him pack. Myra's flight landed at noon dot. We didn't speak much. Just folded clothes, zipped bags, exchanged small, polite words like strangers returning to their roles. When he left, he paused at the front door, hand on the knob, his back to me. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, I replied, and then he walked out, and the door clicked shut behind him. And that was it. But I still remember that week, the quiet glances, the whispered confessions, the closeness that never quite became a betrayal, but would always live in the gray between right and wrong. Sometimes love isn't a romance. Sometimes it's a mirror. And sometimes the people who see you most clearly are the ones you can never really keep.